The morning Elspeth Crane was thrown out of the only home she'd ever known, the temperature in Harlan County, Kentucky, sat at 11 degrees below zero. She was 15 years old, barefoot in a pair of worn-through stockings, clutching a flour sack that held everything she owned in this world. 2 books, a wool scarf her mother had knitted before the tuberculosis took her, and half a biscuit she'd hidden from breakfast. The year was 1934, and the mountains didn't care whether you lived or died. Her uncle, Dale Crane, stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with his arms crossed and his jaw set like a man hammering a fence post. His wife, Dora, peered over his shoulder with a look that was equal parts satisfaction and relief. "You think you're better than everybody," Dale said, his breath turning white in the frozen air. "You think your books and your big ideas make you something special. Well, I'll tell you what you are. You're a mouth to feed that don't earn its keep, and you're done feeding here." Elspeth did not cry. She had not cried since the night her mother died in the back room of this same farmhouse, 2 years earlier, while Dale and Dora argued in the kitchen about who was going to pay for the burial. She had learned something that night that most people don't learn until much later, if they learn it at all, that tears are a language and some people don't speak it. What had Elspeth done to deserve this? The answer to that question requires understanding the kind of child Elspeth was and the kind of world she had been born into. Her father, William Crane, had been a coal miner who could recite poetry, a dangerous combination in Harlan County. He died in a shaft collapse when Elspeth was 9, leaving behind a wife with consumption and a daughter who had inherited his love of words and his stubborn refusal to accept that the world owed him nothing. Her mother, Catherine, had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, and even as the disease hollowed her out from the inside, she made Elspeth read aloud every evening by lamplight. "Your mind is the one thing nobody can take from you," Catherine told her daughter in the last coherent conversation they ever had. "Everything else, money, home, people, it can all disappear. But what you know, what you understand, that stays." Catherine died on a November evening in 1932, and Elspeth was placed in the care of Dale, her father's older brother, and his wife, Dora. They took her in not out of love, but out of obligation, and the awareness that the community was watching. Dale was a hard man made harder by the Depression, and Dora was a woman whose capacity for warmth had been exhausted by years of poverty and the loss of her own 2 children to scarlet fever. They did not beat Elspeth. They did not starve her. They simply made it clear, in 1,000 small daily cruelties, that she was a burden they had not asked for and did not want. Elspeth worked. She hauled water from the well before dawn, fed the chickens, scrubbed floors on her knees, mended fences with hands that cracked and bled in the winter cold, and did everything asked of her without complaint. But she also read every book she could get her hands on, and she asked questions that made the adults around her uncomfortable, not because the questions were impertinent, but because they were good. Why did they plant corn in the same field every year when the yield kept dropping? Why didn't anyone collect the wild ginseng that grew on the north slopes and sell it in Lexington, where it was worth real money? Why did Mr. Patterson's cows get sick every spring when the creek flooded? And had anyone thought about whether the old mine tailings upstream might be poisoning the water? Dale's response to these questions was always the same. "That ain't none of your business, girl." Dora's was simpler, a look that said, clear as spoken language, that a girl who thought too much would never find a husband and would die alone and strange, like old Ida Combs up on Pigeon Creek. The other children in the hollow avoided Elspeth. She was different in a way they could sense, but not name. Not just smarter, but differently oriented toward the world, as though she were looking at the same landscape as everyone else, but seeing an entirely different country. She spent her free time, what little of it there was, reading on the ridge above the farm, where she could see the mountains rolling away to the horizon like frozen waves. And she would imagine all the things that existed beyond those mountains that she had read about but never seen. But Elspeth could not stop her mind from working any more than she could stop her heart from beating. And it was this relentless, unstoppable curiosity that led to the incident with the cow. The week before her banishment, Dale had been preparing to slaughter his last dairy cow, Old Bess, because the animal had stopped giving milk. Elspeth had been reading a veterinary manual she'd borrowed from the bookmobile that came through the valley once a month, one of the few bright spots in her life, and she told Dale that the cow wasn't sick. She was just deficient in salt and minerals. The soil in these mountains had been stripped by years of poor farming, and the grass the cow ate had nothing left in it. Give her a salt lick and some crushed limestone mixed in her feed, Elspeth had said. She'll come back to milk inside 2 weeks. Dale had laughed at her. Then he'd told the men at the general store, and they'd laughed too. A 15-year-old girl telling a grown man how to manage his livestock. But Dora's brother, who had some education, quietly told Dale to try it. And when Bess started giving milk again within 10 days, Dale didn't feel grateful. He felt humiliated. A child, a girl, had shown him up. And in Harlan County in 1934, that was something a man's pride could not survive. So on the coldest morning of January, he put her out. If you want to find out how a barefoot 15-year-old girl survived that winter and built something that would eventually feed hundreds of families across 3 counties, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Elspeth Crane created in the mountains of eastern Kentucky became something that agricultural scientists still study to this day. Elspeth walked. She had no destination and no plan, only the understanding that if she stopped moving, she would freeze to death before noon. The road out of the hollow was a rutted track of frozen mud that wound between the mountains like a snake trying to escape a fire. She followed it north because the wind was coming from the south, and walking into the wind would have killed her faster. She walked for 6 hours. Her feet went from burning to numb to something beyond numb, a strange absence, as though her body had simply decided to stop reporting from that region. She ate her half biscuit. She wrapped her mother's scarf around her feet, 1 foot at a time, switching every quarter mile or so to try to keep some feeling alive. The mountains rose on either side of her like the walls of a church built by a god with no interest in mercy. By afternoon, the light was already failing. January in the Kentucky mountains gives you perhaps 8 hours of usable daylight, and Elspeth had burned through most of them. She was following a creek now. She'd read somewhere that water flows toward civilization, and it was the only strategy she had. The creek led her through a narrow gap between 2 ridges, and on the other side of that gap, she found what would become her salvation. It was an abandoned homestead, set into the south-facing slope of a mountain hollow. The cabin had collapsed years ago, nothing left but a stone chimney standing like a broken finger pointing at the sky. But behind the cabin, built into the hillside itself, was something remarkable. A series of stone-walled chambers dug directly into the mountain. Root cellars originally, maybe 4 of them, connected by low passageways, with heavy timber doors that had somehow survived the years. The previous owner, whoever they'd been, had been a serious farmer. The chambers were deep enough that the earth's own warmth kept them above freezing, even in the dead of winter. Elspeth could feel it the moment she ducked inside, a change in the air, from killing cold to something merely uncomfortable. She survived that first night by pulling the timber door shut and curling into a ball on the dirt floor, wrapped in every scrap of fabric she possessed. She did not sleep so much as drift in and out of consciousness, her body fighting a war between exhaustion and the survival instinct that kept her shivering. Shivering, she knew from her reading, was good. It meant your body was still trying. The next 3 weeks nearly killed her. There is a difference between reading about survival and living it, and Elspeth learned that difference in the most brutal classroom imaginable. She found, in the ruins of the cabin, a few tools, a rusted axe head, a broken shovel, some crockery, and a cast-iron pot with a crack running down one side that still held water if you were careful. In the woods surrounding the hollow, she found what the winter forest offers to those who know where to look. Dried hickory nuts that the squirrels had missed, the inner bark of slippery elm that can be boiled into a passable gruel, wintergreen berries buried under the snow, and the frozen carcasses of 2 rabbits that a fox had cached and forgotten beneath a fallen log. She taught herself to build fires in the stone chambers using the chimney's old flue, which still drew air upward through natural cracks in the rock. The first fire nearly smoked her out. She hadn't cleared the flue properly and spent an hour coughing in the dark before the draft caught and the smoke began to rise. She melted snow for water and boiled it in the cracked pot. She rationed everything with the precision of a person who understands that the margin between survival and death is measured in calories. There were days when she was so weak she could barely stand. There was one night, during the 2nd week, when she woke to find herself unable to feel her hands or feet, and she lay in the dark, seriously considering whether this was where her story ended, in a hole in a mountain, alone, 15 years old, with nobody in the world who would notice her absence. But something in her refused the ending. Maybe it was her mother's voice, still echoing somewhere in the chambers of her mind. Maybe it was simple stubbornness. She forced herself up, forced herself to move, forced blood back into her extremities through sheer will and friction, and by morning she had a fire going and a pot of elm bark tea warming her from the inside. But it was on the 19th day, when she was exploring the deepest of the root cellars, that Elspeth made the discovery that would change everything. The back wall of the 4th chamber wasn't stone, it was earth, and when she dug into it with her broken shovel, she broke through into a natural cavity in the limestone. A cave. Not a vast cavern, but a long, narrow passage that ran perhaps 60 feet deeper into the mountain, before opening into a wider space roughly the size of a barn. And this space had something that made Elspeth sit down on the cold stone floor and laugh for the first time since her mother died. Water. A spring, trickling from a crack in the limestone, running across the floor and disappearing into another crack on the far side. Fresh, clean, constant water that emerged at a steady 55 degrees year-round, as the deep earth maintains its temperature regardless of what the surface is doing. And where there is water at 55 degrees inside a mountain, there is the possibility of life. Elspeth's mind, that magnificent instrument that Dale Crane had tried to break like a fiddle he couldn't play, began to work. She knew from her reading, from the veterinary manual, from the farming almanacs, from the encyclopedia volumes she'd devoured at the bookmobile, that dairy animals need 3 things: water, food, and a stable temperature. Cows were too large for what she was imagining, but goats were not. And in the hills of eastern Kentucky, goats were considered barely a step above vermin. People kept them, but they didn't value them. A person could acquire goats. Over the following months, as winter broke into a grudging spring, Elspeth began to build. She cleared the root cellars and reinforced their walls with stones she hauled from the creek bed. She widened the passage to the inner cave and built a proper ventilation system using hollow logs as pipes, running them through the earth to the surface above. She understood, intuitively and from her reading, the principle that would later be called earth-sheltered agriculture, that the ground itself is an insulator, maintaining temperatures that make both plant and animal husbandry possible even in extreme climates. She terraced the south-facing slope above the cellars and planted what she could scavenge: wild onions transplanted from the creek bank, ramps, Jerusalem artichokes she dug from an abandoned garden 3 miles away. She gathered pokeweed and lamb's quarters and the dozen other plants that grow in the margins where civilization meets wildness, the places nobody owns because nobody thinks they're worth owning. But the goats, that was the heart of her plan. She got her first 2 goats in May from an old woman named Ida Combs, who lived alone on Pigeon Creek, 4 miles over the ridge. Elspeth had heard about Ida from conversations overheard at the general store during her years with Dale. Ida was considered strange, a hermit, a woman who talked to animals and grew herbs that decent people were suspicious of. When Elspeth appeared at her door, thin as a fence rail and brown as a walnut from months of outdoor living, Ida looked at her for a long time and said, "I wondered when you'd get here." Ida didn't mean she'd been expecting Elspeth specifically. She meant she'd been expecting someone like Elspeth, someone the world had thrown away who had the sense to land on their feet. Ida had been that person herself 50 years earlier. She gave Elspeth 2 young does and something worth more than gold: knowledge. Ida knew goats the way a poet knows language, and over the following summer she taught Elspeth everything: breeding, feeding, milking, the treatment of common ailments, the art of reading an animal's body and behavior. "A goat will tell you everything you need to know," Ida said, "if you bother to listen. Most people don't listen to goats. Most people don't listen to anything that isn't exactly like themselves." By the fall of 1934, Elspeth had 4 goats housed in the first 2 root cellars, which she'd converted into surprisingly effective underground stables. The constant temperature of the earth-sheltered chambers, hovering around 50 to 55 degrees, meant the goats didn't burn calories fighting cold in winter, which meant more of their feed energy went into milk production. She'd lined the floors with straw and built simple milking stands from salvaged timber. The ventilation system she'd constructed kept the air fresh, drawing cold surface air through an underground passage that warmed it before it reached the animals, while stale air rose through a separate chimney. The inner cave, with its spring, became her dairy. The 55-degree water was perfect for cooling milk, and the stable temperature of the cave created ideal conditions for making cheese. Elspeth had found a cheese-making guide in one of her library books, a tattered copy of a USDA Farmer's Bulletin on Home Dairying that she'd borrowed and never returned, one of the 2 books she'd carried out of Dale's house. And she taught herself through months of trial and error. The first batches were disasters: too much acid, too little rennet, contamination from bacteria she hadn't controlled for. She lost more milk than she saved in those early attempts, and losing milk meant losing the calories her body desperately needed. But each failure taught her something, and Elspeth had a gift for learning from failure that most people lack. She didn't take it personally. She took it scientifically. She adjusted one variable at a time, kept notes scratched on flat pieces of slate with a nail, and by the winter of 1935, she was producing a soft goat cheese that she wrapped in wild grape leaves and aged in the deepest part of the cave, where the temperature held steady and the natural humidity of the limestone created conditions that a professional cheesemaker would have envied. It was the cheese that saved her. She began trading it at the general store in Evarts, a town 8 miles from her hollow. She didn't go to Harlan, where Dale lived and where people knew her story. She went to Evarts, where she was just a thin, quiet girl with very good cheese. The storekeeper, a man named Herschel Pratt, tasted her cheese and looked at her the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "I made it," Elspeth said. "Where?" "In the mountain." Herschel didn't ask more questions. He was a practical man, and practical men in 1935 didn't turn away from good product regardless of its source. He began buying Elspeth's cheese, and then her milk, and then the soft herbed butter she'd learned to make from Ida's recipes, flavored with wild ramps and chives that grew on her terraces. Word spread. Not quickly. Things didn't move quickly in the mountains, but steadily, the way a root grows through rock. People began making the trip to Elspeth's hollow, first to buy her products, then to see how she was doing what she was doing. The underground dairy was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. She had expanded it by then, digging new chambers and connecting them with passageways, building an underground complex that housed, by 1937, a herd of 14 goats and included a proper aging cave, a milking parlor, a feed storage room, and a small living quarters for herself, all maintained at a livable temperature by the earth itself while the Kentucky winters raged above. She had solved problems that would have stumped engineers. Drainage channels carved into the cave floor directed animal waste to a composting chamber that in turn heated a small greenhouse she'd built against the south-facing hillside using salvaged window glass. The greenhouse, warmed from below by the composting heat and from above by the winter sun, grew greens all winter, lettuce, kale, spinach, herbs, which she fed to her goats and sold alongside her dairy products. Ida Combs died in the spring of 1938, quietly, in her sleep, the way she had lived, without asking anyone's permission or making any fuss. She left Elspeth her entire property, such as it was, including 6 more goats, a library of herbal knowledge written in a spidery hand in composition books, and a lifetime's worth of accumulated wisdom about living close to the land. Elspeth mourned her deeply and privately. Ida was the first person since her mother who had looked at Elspeth and seen not a problem to be managed, but a person to be valued. She was the proof that Elspeth had needed. Proof that a woman could live on her own terms. That strangeness was not a disease but a kind of gift. That the world's rejection was not the final word on the subject of your worth. In Ida's memory, Elspeth began teaching others what she knew. She did this not out of any grand sense of mission, but because people started showing up. The Depression had entered its long, grinding middle years, and in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, families were desperate in ways that people in cities could barely imagine. Children were eating clay. Men were walking 30 miles to work a shift in a mine that might kill them for wages that wouldn't feed their families. And here was this young woman, barely out of girlhood herself, who had figured out how to produce food year-round in the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. The families that came to learn from Elspeth were, by and large, the same kind of people she was. The ones the system had failed. Widows with children. Men broken by the mines. Families too poor to leave and too proud to starve. Elspeth taught them how to build earth-sheltered animal housing, how to manage goats, how to make cheese and butter, how to extend the growing season using the principles she'd developed. She never charged for teaching. "Knowledge isn't mine to sell," she said. "It passes through me. I just try not to drop it." By 1940, there were 11 families in the surrounding hollows practicing what the county extension agent, when he finally came to investigate, called subterranean integrated dairy farming. The agent, a young man named Robert Calloway, fresh from the University of Kentucky, arrived expecting to find primitive subsistence. What he found instead left him writing a 12-page report that was forwarded to the state agricultural office and eventually to the United States Department of Agriculture. Elspeth's system worked. It worked not because it was sophisticated, though in its way it was remarkably so, but because it was perfectly adapted to its environment. The mountains of eastern Kentucky, which had always been seen as obstacles to farming, turned out to be assets if you thought about them differently. The limestone caves provided temperature regulation. The slopes provided drainage and solar exposure. The forests provided feed supplements and building material. Everything that had been considered a disadvantage became, in Elspeth's hands, an advantage. Then came the winter of 1941, and the crisis that brought Elspeth's past back to her doorstep. A diphtheria outbreak swept through Harlan County. The disease hit the children hardest, as it always does, and the families who were hit hardest of all were the ones in the most isolated hollows, the ones with the least access to food, clean water, and medical care. Dale Crane's own grandchildren were among the sick. The doctor in Harlan told the families that the children needed nourishment, fresh milk, clean food, something to fight with. But it was January, and there was no fresh milk in Harlan County. The cows were dry, the stores were empty, the roads to Lexington were impassable with snow, except in Elspeth's Hollow, where 14 goats were giving milk underground at 55 degrees, and a greenhouse was growing fresh greens over a compost furnace, and a cave held wheels of cheese that had been aging since autumn. It was Herschel Pratt who made the connection. He drove his truck as far as the road would take him, then walked the last 3 miles through waist-deep snow to ask Elspeth for help. He told her about the sick children. He told her who some of those children were. He watched her face when he said the name Crane. Elspeth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How many children are we talking about?" 30, maybe more, spread across a dozen families. "I'll need help carrying it," she said. "I can't haul enough milk and cheese over that ridge by myself." She did not ask which families. She did not set conditions. She did not hesitate, except for that one quiet moment when she absorbed the knowledge that the man who had thrown her into the winter was now, indirectly, asking for her help to save his own family. For 3 weeks, Elspeth and a team of volunteers from the families she'd taught hauled fresh goat milk, cheese, and greenhouse vegetables over the mountain to the quarantined hollows of Harlan County. The milk went to the children first. The cheese went to the nursing mothers. The greens went into broths that the doctor said were as good as any medicine he had. Not all the children survived. Diphtheria is cruel, and 1941 Kentucky was not a place of miracles. But many did, and among those who survived were 2 of Dale Crane's grandchildren. Dale came to see Elspeth in March, after the thaw. He was an old man by then, not in years, but in the way the mountains age a person, grinding them down like water over stone. He stood in the entrance to her underground dairy and looked at what she had built, and something in his face broke open like the earth in spring. "I was wrong about you," he said. Elspeth, who was 22 years old and already wiser than most people ever become, looked at her uncle and said, "You were wrong about a lot of things, Uncle Dale. But so was everybody else. That's not a sin. The sin is staying wrong when the truth is standing right in front of you. He left without saying anything more. But the following week, a package arrived at the general store in Evarts with Elspeth's name on it. Inside was a framed photograph of her mother as a young woman, smiling, standing in a field of wildflowers. On the back, in Dale's rough handwriting, "She would have been proud." Elspeth hung that photograph in the cave where she aged her cheese, where the temperature never changed and the air was always still, and where it would remain for the next 40 years. The decades that followed were kind to Elspeth Crane in the way that kindness comes to people who have earned it through suffering and work. In 1943, she married Thomas Wilder, a quiet, steady man who had come to learn her methods and stayed because he recognized in Elspeth something he'd been looking for without knowing it. A person who was exactly, completely, uncompromisingly herself. They had 3 children, all of whom grew up in the Hollow, and all of whom learned the trade. By the 1950s, the Wilder Dairy, as it came to be known, was supplying goat cheese, milk, and butter to stores across 3 counties. The underground facility had grown to include 12 chambers housing over 40 goats, along with aging caves, a processing room, and what amounted to a small underground farm. The University of Kentucky sent students to study Elspeth's methods. The Cooperative Extension Service produced a pamphlet based on her techniques that was distributed throughout the Appalachian region. More importantly, the network of families Elspeth had taught had become a community. Dozens of small underground and earth-sheltered dairy operations scattered through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, each one adapted to its particular landscape, each one feeding families that the larger economy had forgotten. These weren't wealthy operations. Nobody got rich, but nobody starved either, and in the mountains of Kentucky in the mid-20th century, that was no small thing. Elspeth Wilder died on a Tuesday morning in October of 1992, at the age of 73, in the bedroom of the house Thomas had built for her above the original root cellars. Her children were with her, and her grandchildren, and the sound that accompanied her passing was the one she'd woken to every morning for nearly 60 years, the soft calling of goats in the chambers below, waiting to be milked, waiting to be fed, continuing their ancient cycle of need and provision that Elspeth had understood better than almost anyone. The underground dairy is still operating. Her granddaughter, Lily Wilder, runs it now, with modern improvements, but the same basic principles: earth-sheltered, gravity-fed, adapted to the mountain rather than fighting against it. The cheese is sold at farmers markets as far away as Lexington and Louisville. The university still sends students, and in the small cemetery on the ridge above the hollow, Elspeth's headstone reads simply, "She fed people." What strikes me most about Elspeth's story is not the ingenuity, though it was extraordinary. It's not the resilience, though that was remarkable too. What strikes me is the nature of the thing that got her thrown out in the first place. She was too smart. She knew too much. She saw solutions where others saw only problems. And for that, she was punished. How many times in your own life have you been made to feel that the things that make you different are the things that make you wrong? How many times have you shrunk yourself to fit into a space that was never built for someone like you? And what might you build if you stopped shrinking? Elspeth Crane didn't set out to revolutionize mountain agriculture. She set out to survive. But the tools she used to survive, her curiosity, her love of learning, her refusal to accept that the world had to be the way other people said it was, those were the same tools that built everything that came after. The same mind that Dale Crane called a liability was the mind that fed his grandchildren when nothing else could. The things that make you difficult are often the things that make you indispensable. The questions that annoy people are often the questions that need to be asked. And the places where you don't fit are often the places that need to be rebuilt entirely. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things against impossible odds. Because sometimes the people who change the world the most are the ones the world tried hardest to throw away. Elspeth Crane walked barefoot into the winter with half a biscuit and 2 books. She walked out the other side of that winter with a vision that fed 3 counties and lasted generations. What she built wasn't just a dairy. It was proof that the human mind, when it refuses to be defeated, can turn even a hole in a mountain into a cathedral of possibility.